Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Cryosphere podcast. We are going to be calling these segments the Cryosphere Chats from now on, and we're going to be doing these regularly for at least a while, depending on what the reception is and how much we enjoy doing them ourselves. On today's episode, we are again joined by Daniel Walters, Eric Magro, and Rebecca Ziegler. Wave, everybody. And myself, Max Marty, of course. So, gentlemen and lady, what has been tickling your fiddles for the past couple of
Tickling
weeks?
your fiddles. Tickling.
Yeah, that
What are you
what an
Always
talking
weird
about?
yeah,
phrases.
what an
No.
awkward start.
Wow.
I'm going to have an awkward start for every single one. With Eric
Please do it.
unzipping his
Please do it.
fly and
What?
tickling fiddles and everything.
No. But yeah,
Well,
okay.
we
So
we
go
have
ahead,
to
Becky.
start with Eric. He's the
We
one
should.
with the
We have
only
to start
person
with
who's changed his background, right? He's the
I have,
globetrotter.
and
Where are you
this
right
is
now, Eric?
this is not an
Traveler, Eric.
artificial. This is not a Zoom background. I'm in Cofrentes, Valencia, in Spain, at a like longevity resort. Yeah, you can do all kinds of things here, like uh, plasma plasmapheresis and measure VO2 max. I haven't done any of that, but this is just where the Longevity Biotech Fellowship is being hosted. So this is the seventh iteration of LBF, and the point of LBF is to find really ambitious people that want to work on aging and get them up to speed on what's going on. So sometimes these people are coming from inside of biotech. Sometimes they're coming from outside. So there's people here from AI, some people in the community from that have like an academic physics background, just all sorts of people, business people, policy people. So yeah, try to get them up to speed and then get them connected. So figure out what they want to work on and introduce them to potential co-founders, investors, whatever it is that might help. So I'm helping to run this event. There isn't a lot of cryonics representation. So many of the regulars that would have normally come and talked about cryonics that weren't able to make it for a variety of reasons. But Ashwin is here. So Ashwin de Wolf is here doing workshops. He did a session yesterday. I think maybe two sessions. And then this morning I hosted a fireside where I basically interviewed him. And yeah, we've just been having like a really interesting time talking to people about, like, some people don't really know much about what's going on in cryonics. We're also talking about at this event interesting things happening in replacement technology, people revealing some progress they're making, and bioengineering. So people from companies like BioAge. Yeah, so
Eric, are any of the videos from that event going to be made public?
there are no videos. So this is a pretty private gathering, and a lot of the stuff discussed here isn't intended to be shared widely. So people are operating stealth companies or working on projects that they're just not ready to discuss publicly yet. So it's a really cool place to be, in part for that reason.
So does this event make you more bullish, generally speaking, on cryonics or replacement or longevity or any of these topics?
I think we are on track to make progress in bioengineering, and I think there are a lot of ways that AI will be able to help with that. And but it's still in development, right? There's still lots of data that we need to collect. There's bottlenecks to unleashing AI on this problem and solving, like, coming up with actual solutions to solve aging. But the progress is being made, and people are doing a lot of interesting things. So like people today were talking about virtual cells and partial reprogramming. A lot of cool stuff happening. On the replacement side, I only started learning about that replacement technology in companies working on it about, I don't know, a little over a year ago. But in that time, I've been like very surprised by the amount of progress that has been made. So I'm very excited about developments there. In cryonics, it's it's really hard to say because it's hard to say what will really meaningfully change things. And there just aren't a lot of people trying. And so, I mean, and there aren't a lot of resources. I mean, I know Becca wants to talk about, and I'm similarly, I think it's would be an interesting topic, that on Till Labs, which was previously Cradle, has raised a lot of money to work on cryopreservation. So it's like a lot of money that could be deployed to work on this on a similar problem, right? Like, I think
Yeah.
they're focused on organ cryopreservation now, but the field just doesn't have a lot of historically it hasn't had a lot of attention or resources. Maybe that's going to change. It seems like because of Laura Deming, it has already changed a little bit. People are paying more attention and more interested in funding things. So, but yeah, I don't think we're on track to make major progress there. If you look at like historical trends, but yeah, let's
Yeah,
see. We can have a discussion about it.
I see it as at least a good sign that people are starting to take the space seriously for investment. The thing I'm a little unsure about is the kind of organ preservation as a pipeline to cryopreservation idea. I know that seems to be what Until is going for. Like start with organ preservation and then work your way up to cryopreservation. And even Alcor to some extent has changed a bit of its messaging to focus on organ preservation. And I don't know that I fully understand the logic. And maybe, Daniel, I know you're not a researcher at Alcor, but maybe you have some insights on why Alcor is doing this, because there's a few angles that I see. One is that it could be a natural stepping stone. You start with organs because they're easier, and then eventually you go to larger organisms, the whole organism. I'm hesitant about that because I don't actually know that organ preservation, as it's used today in the medical field, it doesn't require cryopreservation, and it doesn't. It seems like that this type of science you would need to go down to the cool temperatures of cryopreservation. It's like a different problem than organ preservation is facing today. But the other angle that I could imagine is that companies are doing it to try to be a bit more palatable, to start with organ preservation and present themselves more as an organ preservation company, and hide the cryonics in the background a little bit, as somewhat of a gateway.
I mean, there is an
Um,
actual market for organ preserve. Like people need organs, right? So you can, when you're talking to investors, I'd imagine it's a lot easier if you can talk in the language of like, okay, there's an existing market, there are like customers for these products. Cryonics is sort of weird. I mean, I've my the like contentious say I think thing I say to like a lot of cryonicists is like no one really wants this product, and it like it's like very few people
Yeah.
actually want it, but a lot of people want viable organs.
But then how do we actually know, if the investors are coming because of organ preservation, because they see that as a less weird or more viable, what makes you think that down the line the company is ever actually going to make the pivot towards cryopreservation? Because if they actually succeed, they actually make some advancements and they make a good amount of money, isn't there going to be a lot of pressure to just continue in that direction and not pivot towards cryopreservation?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I don't, I'm not entirely convinced that like you need to solve organ cryopreservation to solve most of the problems and on the like resolving the issues with the organ waitlist, like logistics problems, like getting people organs, properly matched organs in time would probably require keeping the organ viable for maybe a week max. So yeah, I mean, I think you could do better matching if you have more time. Does that mean you need to store it at liquid nitrogen temperatures? I mean, it's, you know, I'm not sure, but it's a good question.
I want to hear from Daniel. What's the Alcor angle? Why are they leaning more into organ preservation?
okay, I'm just gonna go to my old post called "Connecting the Dots: Why Organ Preservation Matters," and these are kind of the key reasons. So one of them is about validation. So with kidneys, you can like do transplants to prove functionality. You can't transplant a brain yet, so kidney is kind of a good standard for testing methods. Also, kidneys have like apparently like very simple vascular architecture. So compared to other organs with multiple arteries, it's just simpler to perfuse the kidney and cryoprotect it. There are other like challenging aspects and regions within the kidney that are harder to preserve, so it's also a good testing ground for different techniques. Insofar as kind of Alcor, they are using kind of pig kidneys, which are human-sized, and apparently nobody's ever successfully cryopreserved, thawed, and transplanted a human-sized organ. So I think they're also taking an angle that's a little different than some of the other research being done on that.
I also heard it was because kidneys are, um, like some percentage of the kidney cannot work and the kidney as a whole still kind of functions. So it's more forgiving, right? There's more like a flexibility in that. Whereas a brain, if like 30% of your brain is not working, the brain is not working. It's like not
Yeah.
going to properly, be able to be.
I feel like sometimes 30% of my brain's not working. I don't know.
That's just we need
Maybe
more
it's
coffee, right?
okay. Sorry, this
That-
is an aside, but this reminds me of I don't know if this was in the zeitgeist when you guys were all younger, but there was this idea when I was young
That you
that
only use
apparently a
10% of
lot of
your
other people
brain
had.
in this thing?
Yes, exactly, that you're not using 100% of your brain. They made a whole movie. I think it was called Lucy. It's incredibly
I remember
corny,
I
but
watched it.
yeah. But in reality, I think using 100% of your brain is just called having like an insane seizure and probably dying. So not good.
Yeah.
Do you think the other angle I talked about, where it's maybe a bit of a gateway, makes any sense? Do you think that if we make advances in organ preservation, that this could actually help persuade people to be interested in cryonics?
Can't hurt.
I
yeah.
really
Yeah,
don't think so, actually. My immediate reaction is no. Absolutely, like, definitely not.
yeah, I actually think I agree with Eric, but this kind of brings me to another thing I wanted to talk about. I'm curious of, we've been in chronics for a long time. I want to know if any of you actually have success stories of convincing someone who was initially not interested in chronics to sign up.
Oh, that's interesting. Because I have convinced people to sign up, but they were all initially interested.
Right.
Yes, I do. As far as she tells me, at least, I've convinced my mother. She hasn't yet actually done it,
Really?
but she says she's totally in favor of it now.
But
Okay,
she
but
used. What was her initial reaction?
She's religious. She's Catholic. So her initial reaction was, "That's interesting, but I wonder how." I think she had concerns about how it interplayed with her beliefs
Yeah,
and
sure. Okay.
her
I've encountered
actual
that.
beliefs. Yeah. But when we talked about it, and she kind of thought it through, and she was like, "Well, yeah, either in the case where." In either, if I am coming back and I am alive in some sense, then my soul never left, and therefore I'm okay, and all this stuff. So we talked about that, and she said, "Yep, it seems perfectly reasonable. So, and if it doesn't work, then who cares? I'll end up in wherever I'm going to end up anyway." So I think she that seemed like a plausible argument to her, and I said, "Wouldn't you like to be around in the future when I'm around, and maybe other people, like a lot of other people that you love are around?" And that also was. Uh, Weighed heavily in her thinking on it. So yeah, we just have to eventually now get her to actually sign up. But yeah,
To narrow down the spirit of the question, and Becca, tell me if I'm missing it. I feel like if we take out family members who may sign up for emotional reasons, less so that they're convinced and more so that they're willing to do it for their family members who they love and who are kind of raising the issue as important to them, kind of take out that personal issue, and then re-ask the question of someone who was initially uninterested and became interested through the persuasion of the logic of the idea of cryonics. I think that would
yeah.
make it a little bit harder.
And Daniel, do you have any stories? Because I think out of all of us, you're the one who's most willing to go up to strangers and just start talking to them about chronics. I've witnessed it many times.
I have
Yeah.
such a hilarious story that I'm not going to share on this topic, so you can all know
Uh,
that there is a really funny story that I'm not going to say.
that's
how
Uh,
could you do
Jesus
that to
like
us,
that.
Eric?
Yeah,
That's so against the spirit of a
Sorry, I don't
podcast
know.
to not
I need
share.
Daniel's permission.
tight-lipped
I
over
can
here.
share it if I have, because
Why
I
don't
know
you just
he
share it,
knows.
and then
He
if it's
knows what I'm talking
bad,
about.
We'll
if it's
edit it out.
bad, we cut it out.
Yeah.
How about
Oh,
that?
okay. No. Here, Eric. You can text me separately and tell me, and I'll
You
let
know
you
what
know.
I'm talking about. It happened very recently.
Oh, I see. Okay. No.
Dang it. Okay, we'll have to cut this
Um,
out.
I
Such
have
a
a good one
tease. Okay.
afterwards. After your
Okay.
yeah.
All right. But
um,
Daniel, have you ever exceeded in all of your talking to strangers?
um, I don't think so. And I actually have, while I do it out of almost for like practice and sport at this point, just to talk to people, because I also just enjoy talking about it. Oftentimes, I'll even go into it not necessarily trying to convince someone or not expecting to convince them, but I'll just do it because don't know. I just like talking about the subject, even if I know I'm not going to be successful. But overall, I've moved away from thinking I'm going to convince anybody who is coming at it like cold. And kind of my theory about it now is that there's X amount of hurdles and roadblocks uh, that you have to get over to find cryonics interesting proposition. And I don't know the exact number. I haven't put it onto paper. One day I'll write an article about it. But let's just say there's 10 hurdles you have to jump over, and then you're kind of convinced and want to do cryonics. All of us have jumped over all 10. Obviously, you know, this is not like a standardized method here, but let's just say all chronicists who have signed up have jumped over almost all of those hurdles to get an interest. Now, if we take someone, you know, who has no interest in chronics, and just let's say your standard person who shares, you know, the common values, they may have one or two at most of, you know, those hurdles covered. And so trying to get the other 8 is a real like headache, and very unlikely as well. And so kind of my shift, and something we've talked about before, is, you know, go for people who already have passed most of those hurdles, right? 9 out of 10, you know. And in my experience, the people who share almost all the things except for 1 or 2 are the people in the longevity space, generally speaking. They want to live longer. They don't like the idea of dying. They have positive views of the future. They share so much with chronicists in common that there's just a lot less work to do to get over those hurdles with them. Now, that doesn't mean that those final hurdles are just easy to get over. I think the biggest one, and we saw some of it at Vitalist Bay, is the belief that they won't need cryonics because their timeline, you know, is favorable, and that they'll reach longevity escape velocity and therefore won't have to die and won't require cryonics. And that's a hard one to get over, but I think that's where we should like focus our energy on figuring out how to convince people who have that last hurdle, you know, that that cryonics actually does make sense. And okay, so that's my whole theory about it, and I kind of at this point think that's where, if you're going to attempt to convince someone cold, those are the kinds of people who you'll have more success with. So unless you enjoy the just talking about cryonics for the hell of it, I would say it's not particularly practical pursuit.
All right, I have my own theory about it, but I'll let Max, if you have a story about trying to convince someone.
Well, I actually successfully convinced someone named Ayla, who people have probably heard of. I met her. I had seen her at a party, and I don't remember how we got on the subject, but she was not signed up, and she told me the reason that she wasn't signed up was because she had spoken to her name at the time was Robert McIntyre back whenever. Now it's a different name. But anyway, she had spoken to this person who had told her basically, it's not going to work. Cryonics is scientifically unsound because the amount of damage that's done to the brain and the process, et cetera, even using cryoprotectants, blah, 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 is sufficient to cause enough damage that forget it. You're never going to get anything back anyway. And we talked about it for a while. And we talked about the kinds of advancements that have been made, but it was really more, I think in her case, the kind of like, it's still a good bet. Like, yeah, we don't actually know how much damage we're going to be able to reverse. We may or may not be able to reverse the amount of damage that ultimately will happen specifically to her in her case whenever she happens to need the services. But we may. And if you don't, you know, it's sort of um, the Ralph Merkel, you know, matrix, right? You know, don't take the approach. We know what's going to happen. You do take the approach, you at least have some chance of making it through. And she seemed convinced by that argument, so much so that she was like, "Oh, put me in touch with a life insurance agent," and I did. And far as I know, she followed through on that. But yeah, so I'd say that seemed like a success story. But to the point of what we were talking about before, she's already kind of somebody who's in the realm of believing the kinds of, you know, interested in the future, interested in these kinds of approaches to thinking about life and reality and her own existence and blah blah blah. So, um, to some extent, she just needed that sort of technological scientific doubt to be removed, or at the very least addressed to some extent, to make it worth her while to do it. So I do think if you're talking about the average person whose worldview is very different from ours, convincing them is very, very difficult. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's very difficult. It would require, I mean, just think about how big of an ask it is, right? It's a lot of money. It's a big commitment. It's a thing that for most people you don't openly want to talk about it at the next family get together for Thanksgiving, because you're going to be seen as the weirdo. Most people don't want to be seen as weirdos, and you're going to be shown the door, or at the very least asked to stand in the corner. So it's a big ask for most normal people to do this, and so I think for the task that we are putting on ourselves to make this happen, um, we're doing the best we can, and we just have to sort of muddle through.
All right, but even if she was close to the way there, congrats on getting Ayla across the finish line. You may have saved her life. I'll put that as the title of this podcast: saving Ayla's life. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see.
All right. Well, here's my kind of alternative theory that I'll admit is not fully formed, but I'm curious what you all think about it. I think we've all had the experience where even if you're not necessarily fully trying to convince someone about cryonics, you are having a conversation where you're trying to explain the reasoning about why it makes sense, why maybe the science is sound, why you should want to live longer. And when you're talking to, I'll say, quote unquote, normie, they always have some reason why they're not interested. And then you try to address that reason, and there's always a new reason. And I think just the idea that we can convince them at all through reason is just the wrong approach entirely. I think we're just approaching it completely incorrectly. And part of the reason I think that is because I've been reading a book called How Minds Change. And okay, admittedly, I am on page like 40, so I haven't figured the whole thing out yet. Okay, but here's what I got so far. So
Wow, by the time you're finished, I'm expecting a lot.
I'm gonna have to write something. We'll do a follow-up episode. Anyways,
or we just don't share it at all. We just use the strategies to change everyone's mind.
Right, they're not even gonna know. Absolutely, yeah. It's the key to everything is unlocked. No, but I'm in a section called Deep Canvassing, where it's basically there was this organization that would go around and knock on people's doors and talk to them about kind of contentious political issues. And they would record it, and they would watch them back, and they would do this hundreds and thousands of times until they actually found out how to get people to change their minds. And then I'm just going to read like a quick quote here. Facts don't work. There's no superior argument, no piece of information that we can offer that is going to change their mind. The only way they're going to change their mind is by changing their own mind, by talking themselves through their own thinking, by processing things they've never thought about before, things from their own life that are going to help them see things differently. And then more generally, it talks a lot about how it's not only you have to convince yourself, but it's much more of an emotional decision. As much as we like to think that we are rational creatures, usually it's actually some emotional aspect that's missing, that's leaving you unconvinced. Now, how does that fully apply to convincing people to sign up for cryonics? Maybe I'll know that by page 100 or so. But I do think it highlights the kind of common mistake that just trying to give people the arguments for why cryonics make sense is just never going to work. Thoughts?
Yeah, that piggybacks Max, in your discussion with Ralph Merkel at the Biostasis weekend in Berkeley. I believe he had said something kind of similar to that, where I believe you asked him something along the lines of like, where would you be wrong, even if you didn't know where you were wrong? Where would you be wrong, or what have you been wrong about? And I think one of the main things he said for that is something along the lines of that people are reasonable, and that they'll listen to reason. Although I don't remember. Do you remember the exact way he framed that, Max?
I don't remember it right now. No.
Yeah, but it was along those lines. He thought he's been going kind of along his life trying to convince people with reason about cryonics, and he feels that he's kind of learned the lesson that that doesn't work. I don't know how much he expanded upon it, but it jives with that observation from the book, Becca.
I would
Yeah.
want to make one little distinction, though. I do think some people are reasonable. Like some people, like a lot of people who probably already have signed up for cryonics are the very small percentage of people who are convinced by these kinds of arguments. So they are out there.
I'm actually not sure I agree. So I think the mistake that might be made here is those people are just emotionally in the right place to receive the arguments. And that's why they're convinced, because they're like already emotionally, like they maybe they feel the desire to live longer. They're kind of like anti-norm. They're already in the right emotional headspace, so to speak, to be open to cryonics, but it's not actually the arguments that convince them.
So that's interesting. So we would just be, the idea behind that one is that we're just post-rationalizing that it's a logical reason, but
Yeah.
we're essentially the same as everybody else, in that we've come to it emotionally, and now we're just coming up with reasons why, that make us look good to ourselves. That it was very logical and Spock-like the way we came to our feelings
I don't
about
know
this.
that I would jettison reason this fully and like, of course, I do think we're in an emotional place where we're able to hear the arguments and we're going to process them differently. But I think for most people, they're in a place where when they hear the arguments, they're going to start immediately coming up with reasons why it can't work, or reasons why, they would have to be. I think Tim Urban had this approach in his book, right? Like, must I believe this, or can I believe this? Like that different framework. And for a lot of people, I think they would be in a like very resistant position to even tackling these arguments from an unbiased perspective. Whereas for many of us, and certainly not all cryonicists, I'm sure there's a lot of cryonicists who signed up for purely emotional reasons. But I think for a lot of us, at least for myself, I think I evaluated the arguments, and I've evaluated the people making the arguments, which of course, we often believe, we choose what to believe by choosing who to believe. So there's some part of it is that. But a lot of us looked at these arguments, looked at the people making these arguments. Are these people who we otherwise trust on a lot of things? Yes. Okay. The arguments make sense. Yes. And we moved forward. Because I want to have a chance at seeing the distant future and living, some indefinite lifespan and all this. But if I thought cryonics was not the right approach to doing that, I wouldn't be wasting my time, right? I have picked some religion that I thought was more likely to make it happen. So I think we just there are differences in how rational people are, and there are differences in how rational people employ or deploy that rationality based on different topics. And I think we happen to align in ways that allowed us to deploy our rationality into this topic, which is beneficial because I think it's actually the right way to do it.
I don't want to argue with you about your own psyche, Max, but I do think it's incorrect to view this as a frame of just more or less rational people. Because you mentioned that people, they're always trying, they're not like open to hearing the arguments rationally. I actually don't think that's the problem for most people. I remember someone on the Cryosphere server saying that the reason that his mother was against it, or the reason she gave him about not being interested, is because she said she was very concerned about how she would look when she was in cryopreservation, and that it would make her look ugly, and that it wouldn't preserve her beauty. And like there's like all sorts of reasons. People, they sometimes get so out there with their reason for why they're not interested in cryonics, and eventually you sort of come to the conclusion is like they don't want to be convinced, not because they don't find the arguments convincing, is because they're just not fundamentally, they don't feel the need to live longer. They don't feel that like the underlying value proposition of cryonics is not something that they emotionally care about. And that's why it doesn't matter
we're not
the
in
number of arguments.
No, we're not in disagreement. Yeah, I totally agree. I'm just saying, like, for a small percentage, look how small the number of people sign up are. Small percentage of people were emotionally in the right place to listen, to hear the arguments and consider them, and then did it, and then et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, you need to be emotionally in the right. You need to have a desire for the end goals that you would get from even listening to the arguments before you're willing and able to listen to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It kind of does part of what the quote said in the book about, people having to convince themselves. It does jive with the two success stories that I have for convincing people. And I don't know actually if I can take credit for this, because it was not me directly convincing them, which is kind of the point. And that is that I witnessed two normies, maybe three, I guess, who were not initially into cryonics, and I guarantee in most circumstances never would have signed up. And I witnessed their transformation into two of them signing up, one of them understanding it at the end. So one of them was a social anthropologist who was at the Tomorrow Bio office for several months and talked to a lot of members. She was doing a research project on people that it was like a techno immortalist project of some sort. And she told me at the end, she said, I had come in thinking, this is something where people are just trying to avoid death. And I just didn't really get it personally. But after being in the office for months, listening to us talk to customers, give podcasts, give all the arguments, she was like, I get it. I understand like why you would do this. Like I kind of personally, I get it. And the other two are close friends of mine who work at Tomorrow Bio, who also came in not necessarily personally interested. They thought it was a cool topic, but they weren't interested. And over time, they slowly became interested and are now signed up. And I think the key there is nobody ever tried to directly convince them. It was just like a processing of arguments slowly and slowly thinking about yourself and being exposed to a place where you're forced to just deal with it internally that eventually you convert. This makes me optimistic and pessimistic. In some sense, it's a good sign that like the normies can be converted, that even people that typically aren't on maybe the right emotional and rationality scale, they can eventually sign up. The downside is, of course, we can't expose most normies to months of being around cryonics and being forced to think about it. But I still think it's not hopeless, but we do need to somewhat change the way we approach trying to get people to sign up.
I have a story somewhat similar from a different angle. So I was actually talking to Jeremy Wiggins. He's a Alcor Canada board member and Dart team member for Alcor Canada on an Alcor podcast, and he was describing how he, although he was into deployment and recovery and had a lot of extensive knowledge about cryonics and cryonics procedure, he wasn't yet personally invested in it at the time. But through doing cases with Dart, he emotionally kind of came to desire being a cryonicist and being cryopreserved himself from seeing kind of how bodies are treated at traditional funeral homes and like open casket kind of things, and seeing that process to him felt very disrespectful to bodies after the fact that he was interacting with bodies through cryonics in a very respectful manner for the purposes of cryopreservation, where you treat the bodies with extreme kind of caution, as if they are still alive to some extent, because the goal is for them to one day be alive again. And nobody was trying to convince him, and he kind of came to it through that emotional lens of just seeing it in that perspective. Something about that perspective kind of hit him in the right way. And so
we need
I think
to inundate people. The idea is we need to flood the zone with cryonics, and eventually maybe maybe we'll get there.
That's funny, flood zone.
Yeah.
So in one way, I think it's important to experiment if this kind of angle really is the better angle. In another way, it doesn't necessarily make it much easier, because the examples that the few examples that we do have where this works, like you're saying, it's not a trivial amount of information that needs to be imparted upon people to get into that mindset.
Yeah. Although I do think that it could be perfected, right? The in the book when they talk about deep canvassing, they are in with one conversation getting people to change their minds about things that they seem to have very strong opinions about. And political topics, you could argue there's a lot of information also you need to know to change your mind there. So I think if you do it really intentionally, I think there are single conversations that you could have that could shift people's perspective, but it would have to be done differently, not presenting cryonics and trying to explain what cryonics is and why it makes sense, but more asking them about letting them speak and letting them think through it, knowing that cryonics is something that they should be thinking about in the back of their minds, but it may be prompting them about, what would you do if you had an extra 50 healthy years? What's something that you had to give up because you felt like you didn't have enough time for this hobby, or you couldn't pursue this other career path that you would have been interested in? Maybe start there and just let them talk themselves through it, and try to get them to understand the underlying value of wanting to live longer first, and not even try to tell them about, well, listen, it's actually not that expensive. You don't need to be rich, or well, they've done these experiments where they were able to bring this back. It just leaving that out entirely. Yeah, I'd be curious. Maybe it works better.
Yeah.
Maybe next time you run into a stranger, Daniel, try that.
Yeah, well, I think I'm curious when you finish reading the book if you feel like there's more there to be learned. I'll definitely, if you give it the thumbs up, I'll read it myself. Maybe think of an interesting idea. I don't know if people would find this interesting, but we could theoretically on future episodes of this, since it's a little bit more of a lax format, bring on some people who are not chronicists, who we could talk about on air here, and kind of test some of these methods out, with them knowing that we're doing it, and just kind of experiment with what works, and obviously we want someone who is self-aware and willing to explain their thought process out loud, so that we can kind of get an idea of how they're thinking about it, and which things we're saying are more or less persuasive.
On air cryonics interventions, Daniel.
Yeah.
Maybe the audience can, they can send us someone they've been trying to convince, or maybe you can't have someone that has had the well poisoned by someone convincing them before, but I would be kind of curious, like, can we get somebody's mom to sign up? Stakes are high.
I would kind of I want to push back on both of you guys here, though. I think of this as a big framing problem, and I wrote, you guys know I wrote a big article on this, how death is the wrong base concept, but if people continue to think of cryonics as the preservation of you after death, et cetera, et cetera, preserving a corpse, and eventually you get revived in the future and all this stuff, I think that's a huge turnoff, and it forces us to deal with terminology and baggage that we now have to like undo layers and layers and layers of in order to convince anybody that this is a good idea for them, even if they're in some ways their values are aligned. It's still pretty hard. So what I would say is, if you can come up with a system that accurately and quickly and effectively reframes things as, for example, cryosleep, or some other framing that doesn't have to be the one you use. That's the one I liked, I advocated for. But something that, and people have used the term like ambulance to the future, or things like that, right? Like, this is a temporary measure that puts you on pause, and again, avoid the term death, avoid the term revival, avoid all this baggage. I think that would be the key. And in fact, one useful way to do that might be to pair cryonics with other things, like put it within a universe of other things that are seen as medicine, rightfully so, whether it's putting somebody in a medically induced coma, or other way, when, like, during surgeries where they reduce a person's body temperature down to a lower state in order to slow the degradation that can occur due to the lack of oxygen and circulation of blood flow. So if we can put cryonics more in that space, which I think it rightfully belongs in that space, I think we're going to have a much easier time of saying like, hey, you're interested in this, and you're interested in longevity in this way, and you're interested in like doing these things to stay healthy, and you blah, blah, blah. Yeah, cryosleep is part of that package. It's a package
Yeah.
deal. I think that'll be a
Yeah.
lot easier. That's a much easier.
Yeah, I don't think what you're saying is contradicts any of what me and Daniel were just saying. Like, I think you could combine it. You could try to get them to whatever, put themselves in the emotional space and open up about their hopes and dreams for the future, and then also say, well, if you could take an ambulance to the future, would you want to do that, or what do you think about cryosleep, and just let them talk themselves through it. I think it can be part of the strategy. I did really like your article, and I think there could really be something to it. But I think the key thing that hit on is that there's a lot of emotional baggage, so to speak, around the idea of death, right? So it's
Yeah.
not a matter of it being rationally that people can't understand the argument of, it's not information theoretic death, it's just legal death, and even if people can understand that, when you say it, there's still a feeling of death doesn't feel like something you come back from. This feels too insane, and it feels too permanent. And cryosleep feels more attainable.
Yeah. And Max, on that front, I do like the framing argument, does, generally speaking. And I would say, for me, you had kind of run by me the cryosleep term. I like that. I would say still in my mind, I think you have good reasons. I think we discussed it a little bit. In my mind, hibernation was still the closest to what I think people already associate with, not dying and kind of pausing and then waking up from being paused but never having been dead. I kind of like that phrasing more personally. And actually recently with we discussed it very briefly, but Laura Deming's new project, I don't know exactly if what she's planning with it, because it hasn't been like a lot of details, but she's using the terminology hibernation pods. And so I feel like she's touching upon this same framing change that we're discussing here.
Yep.
And I can't remember what can't remember exactly between cryosleep and hibernation the pros and cons. I remember there were some good and bad aspects of both.
When I hear hibernation, I just think of bears, but maybe that's because we had a literal bear hibernating in our backyard when I was growing up. So maybe that's a me thing.
But think of it, if hibernation, right? You know exactly what that refers to, right? The whole premise is encompassed in the word.
Sure.
And to some extent, cryosleep too. Although I think if I was coming at it completely without knowledge of what's being discussed, I feel like hibernation I already would have my head around, whereas cryosleep would still have a second follow-up question of what exactly does that mean. That being said, Max, I do remember there were some good points on your side for why cryosleep might have some pros over hibernation.
And I do think that we don't have to necessarily argue on this conversation about what is the exact perfect phrasing, but we all know death is death is not the one we use, right?
Yeah.
So I think that sometimes we move the frame away from that. We've gained a lot of ground already.
Yeah, but if anyone listening has a strong opinion on vote cryosleep, hibernation, or tell us what the other option is,
Torpor,
let us know in the
maybe.
comments.
No, torpor.
That's like associated with vampires or something, right?
I wouldn't even know what that means.
Yeah,
most people wouldn't. I think.
It's a real thing. Some mammals do it. It's a real thing.
Yeah, I'm thinking with bears, Becca. Is that so bad that we associate it with bears? We need to make we need to make a bear a cryonics mascot, and just.
I think the only problem is that you don't know what because you think bear, you think, okay, but then what does that have to do with humans? Humans can't hibernate, right? Like with cryosleep, there's maybe more of an implication that you have to put into cryosleep, or there's some kind of cryosleep pod, or maybe it's fixed by adding hibernation pod at the end. But hibernation on its own, because it's the thing that bears and other non-human animals do, you might not immediately make the connection, but what does that have to do with humans? We can't do that.
In any case, I think it's something we should keep an eye on and keep as part of the discussion around persuasion. Quite honestly, for years, I've loved this idea of how do we narrow down persuasion for cryonics. For some reason, it feels like it's always getting sidetracked by kind of more practical concerns and all the other things we're doing. But I would ideally really love to focus on this kind of persuasion angle and more going forward in a more concerted, with a more organized, concerted effort. I don't know exactly how we would do that, but
Maybe we
every
need
time
to
the subject comes up, yeah, I'm
maybe we need to
always
start
intrigued.
we need to start deep
Deep
canvassing, and you and
canvassing?
I are going to be knocking on doors
We'll do it.
asking people
We'll do it.
what are their plans for the
Uh,
future. Yeah.
I'm so down for that. I'm happy to like take what I'm already doing and just put it in a more organized fashion to and you know, take notes and be less just shotgun about it, more precision oriented.
Cool. Well, on that note, then, I think we will leave a few other topics for the next time. Thank you, everybody, again for joining us on the Cryosphere Chat. And until next time, this has been Daniel Walters, Rebecca Ziegler, Max Marty, and Eric Magro, who had to leave early, but he will be back with us next time. Thank you, everybody.